Welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. Today I'm joined by Sam Goldstein. So, Sam, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and we'll get going.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, Jean-Paul. I'm I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I've been a defense lawyer for about 25 years. I started off as a Crown. I'm the former director of legal affairs for B'nai B'rith Canada, and I was a bencher from 2019 to 2023. I came up with the idea of a slate, as a matter of fact. I ran on the Stop SOP slate to repeal the Statement of Principles, which we were successful. I did not run. I ran in 2023 as for the bencher in that election, but I didn't run as part of the slate.
Perfect. So maybe let's start. No, I know our topic here focused on governance and the law society, but maybe you could tell us what it's what a bencher really is and your time there from 2019 as a member of the law society.
Sure. So, um, I think, let's just start the present. I think, we all know what has happened, but a little bit of a recap is that just in the end of 2024, it was discovered that Diane Miles was going to be given a compensation package of about close to $1 million. Um, it was not disclosed to the public, the general public legal profession. It was kept secret from them. It was only as a result of a leak to the Toronto Star that it became sort of public knowledge. The Law Society resisted discussing it, doing an investigation. They finally did an investigation. That investigation is known as the O'Connor Report. The O'Connor Report really focused on three people being Sid Troyster, who's a bencher, Megan Shortreed, who's a bencher, and former treasurer Jackie Horvat as people who made the decision to give Diane Miles, the CEO, then CEO, the $1 million compensation, and particularly had decided not to consult convocation with it. In other words, bring it to convocation, have a vote on it. And subsequently, finally, the profession wanted that disclosure of the O'Connor report, and it was finally disclosed. So that's where we are today. Going forward, I just saw recently that the treasurer Waddle, Peter Waddle, wants to appoint a professor from Osgood who's expert in governance issues to consult and in the fall come back with a report to determine what needs to be done, what suggestions of the O'Connor report should be adopted. My point of view, Jean-Paul, is that it's not a matter of tinkering with the bylaws. In effect, it is a cultural problem at the Law Society. And the only way to stop that, or the only way to deal with that cultural problem is to get rid of the Good Governance Coalition and take back the Law Society in 2027. So when I was one of the things that the O'Connor report had pointed out that Diane Miles had success in successive treasurers going back to Treasurer Mercer, Malcolm Mercer. He served the second year in 2019. She had consistently wanted a raise, and Mercer had said to her it wasn't the appropriate climate at convocation to bring her compensation package to convocation. Later on, when after 2023, she sends a letter where it says, now that things are saner at convocation, I want my money. Now, that sort of imperious attitude existed when I was there. The irony of the Good Governance Coalition is, they had this propaganda about how the Law Society was going to lose self-governance. Now, it was just propaganda. There's no way a government would want to take on regulating a vociferous profession like a bunch of lawyers. So it was never going to happen. But what was happening behind the scenes from 2019 to 2023 is people like myself were certainly challenging the established conventions of how things were done. One of the things we wanted to do was to find out how many people actually worked. I wanted to know how many people actually worked at the Law Society and what they actually did. There is a huge budget. I think it's now in 2024, $43 million, if not a little bit more, that's put aside for programs. But when you look at the budget that the Law Society breaks down or shows the public, they don't show what exactly all those programs are. And I can get into some of the programs that they had and some of the things which I found out. So, I kept that, we all of us kept asking questions, at least the beginning, and I continued on. And we never got any answers. And it was clearly what was happening over the 4 years I was there was that things were being shifted more and more away from convocation because they simply didn't want to answer our questions. More recently, there was a court case. Murray Klippenstein had asked for some financial information. It was refused. They even argued, the law society said that directors were not fiduciaries. At the very last moment, on the steps of the courthouse, I think for the discovery, they changed their mind. They accepted the fact that that directors were fiduciaries. The judge, the judge criticized the law society for what they did. They found emails where they were purposely trying to delay and obfuscate giving Murray the information. And so we got a substantial amount, substantial indemnity, which is significant because you get that only when judges start criticizing the actions of the opposing party. But then what they did is they went to convocation, they passed a bylaw that said if you want information, you have to go to the treasurer and ask the treasurer, and only the treasurer has the right to refuse to give you information. And it's the final authority. So there you sort of that's sort of example of the cultural that has to be the culture that has to be changed, the law side. And that was clearly going on before, from 2019 to 2023. So when people were on your show, I saw Stephen Rothstein. I looked at his video because he's now running for treasurer. There's three people running for treasurer coming up in June. It's Peter Wardell is running again, and this new person, Stephen Rothstein, and Murray is running. But Rothstein had said on your program that, things have to change at the Law Society, that we had to have good governance come back. We had to change things. Well, what was happening is, what he really should have been is he should be running for the slate because we were trying to change things. We were trying to get information, making it more public. So, behind the scenes, what was happening in 2019, 2023 is this thing called the Bencher Code of Conduct. And it was constantly being used against people like myself and my group of people who I got elected with to make sure that they didn't cause any trouble. Trouble being is questioning the authority of the treasurer, questioning the authority of the law society, questioning the authority of of the staff. And then more recently, you had Peter Wardle waving the Bencher Code of Conduct around like a sword, threatening people that they couldn't talk about uh, what was going on at the Law Society. And then now you have the election coming up for treasurer, and you're not going to hear anything about that election. You may hear a story about it. There'll be an interview about the three people, but you're not going to hear you're not going to hear any of the debates or concerns that are going on within the Law Society. There's usually some sort of debate where the candidates come forward and they'll talk about what they think and they'll answer questions, but that's all behind closed doors. You can't see that. I don't see why that is behind closed doors. Why can't the profession see that debate? So you've got that culture of secrecy and that culture where they also know better than anyone else. That's also part of it. Let me just sort of go sideways about something, Jean-Paul, which I think is important to understand that's behind it. In 2006, and I'm going to ask you to I'm going to share if I could just share for a moment. I have something I want to show the public that people don't often realize. Are we sharing it? Okay, so what I have up on the screen is from the Law Society Act, just to sort of show you what people are probably dizzy from me scrolling, the Law Society Act, and I've gone to section 4.1. Now it talks about, everyone talks about, defending the public interest, and people talk about access to justice. But in fact, the function of the Law Society, you could quite see as 4.1. The function is to make sure that people are competent and that they're ethical. That's A and B. this issue about society upholding the public and so on, I should say access to justice and so on, is in the principles applied to the law society. And interesting, one of them is here they protect the public interest is in 4.2. 4.2 sub 4, the Saudi has a duty to act in a timely, open, and efficient manner. I think that's funny that we never hear about people talking about that. I'm going to go back now. Now, this was amended in 2006. That 4.2 was put in there. What that created was a bit of a Trojan horse for previous generations of benchers to bring in a political agenda into the law society, which has created this mission creep. I think Michael Cochran was on your show a little while ago, and he talked about the mission creep, and he's absolutely right. But it comes from that 4.2 that people keep thinking that, oh, we have to be access to justice, but they forget that we have to break down barriers. I'm not sure what those barriers are, but the function is to make sure lawyers are competent and lawyers are ethical. That has to be first and foremost. And so through what's happening now is like the exceptions or the principles are swallowing the rule. Everyone talks about access to justice, but no one talks about competency and ethics as much and how that should be the prime goal. So as I said, these benchers brought in a social agenda, a political agenda. Certainly, they came up with the statement of principles. There was a group of lawyers who thought that, like myself, that the law society has to be neutral. And that's what we were trying to do, is bring back a neutrality to the law society. It shouldn't be pushing a political agenda. And the establishment basically resisted that and did everything they can to thwart us and, called us unfit. When it turns out they're the ones who are unfit. That's the irony of what's happening. Listen, the slate was very bad at getting out its message. It was a very, talking about a vociferous profession, it was a vociferous group of people who never agreed on anything except for the fact that we could all vote different ways. And that was hardly, you could accomplish any group action if you all believe you can go off and doing your separate ways. And in fact, that's what happened over the course of 4 years. People became co-opted by the predecessor of the Good Governance Coalition. We never voted in bloc. And we were completely ineffectual in doing anything, and particularly in the last election, hopelessly lost and politically naive in the way they carried about their election, and hence they lost in 2023. But that was some of the experiences. That was generally in a big thrust what was happening in 2019 and 2023 is that they tried, the law society tried to keep its power. Diane Miles tried to accrue a little kingdom, a little fiefdom of her own. You may remember a number of years ago that the law society had voted that Diane, the CEO, had the power over all all physical decisions of the loss of Osgood. So there was a time in which, during the pandemic, she had decided, Diane Miles decided, you could not walk into the building unless you had a mask on. And if you didn't have a mask on, she was going to punish you. There was a bencher who walked in, didn't have a mask, and they brought a huge, it was much, but ultimately like $100,000 went to investigating this bencher and then trying to discipline him. And then the whole thing got, the only way I could put it was screwed up. The whole investigation, the whole hearing into how he should be disciplined got screwed up. And then there was $100,000 for like wasted of people's money. Nothing ended up happening as a result of it. But after that, they voted that she should have the policy, she should have the power to shut down the Osgood building. In other words, prevent even benchers from coming into the building. Imagine, I just thought of the principle of I think it was the King Charles, when he wanted to go into wanted to go into Parliament, and the speaker said, "I have neither eyes to see you nor ears to hear you." You can't allow your CEO to decide not to allow the elected people even into a building. So and then there are other things I can get into, Jean Paul, that had happened, more a little, it's a lot of inside baseball. I don't know how much people may care about it, but there was definitely even within the subcommittees of making sure, because a lot of it was on Zoom, when anyone wanted to speak who was critical of anything that was going on, their microphones were turned off. So you couldn't, so, the people who were part of the slate couldn't make comments. It was just a constant 4 years of, as I say, the predecessors trying to make sure that they kept their power and there was no criticism of the established policies.
Okay, so let me jump in there. There's obviously a lot to kind of unpack, but let's start maybe with the I guess governance in the sense of staff and the board of no, essentially the board of directors being the group of benchers. And no, with any organization, right, where you do have a board and then you do have the operation staff, there is sometimes a back and forth kind of as to who essentially has control of the organization, whether it's the Law Society or any other organization. And so, what have you've shared certainly. Under the sort of the present day issue with Diana Miles and the compensation, and maybe initially feeling when your group had come in that this is not the time to put a raise to the board to approve it because they may not approve it. But it's kind of uh, interesting because once the good governance group comes in afterwards, there's this issue because logically you would think, hey, now we have a new group uh, sort of aligned that they can rubber stamp sort of this proposal. So I mean, let's look at in terms of that back and forth between staff and the board, I mean, both from the past and certainly towards the future, of what role, and you outlined just now, for example, whether whatever the policies may be, but who really should have the authority to kind of bind the Law Society, or should it be kind of a combination of such? And what are your thoughts on that?
No, clearly, particularly on the issues of compensation, there has to be a vote. I mean, for Megan Shortreed to say that she never knew how the process worked when I was there, it's astounding to me. When I was there, we had compensation issues coming up. We had, and they were always voted on by convocation. We had yearly bonuses that were being put forward, and we've convocation voted for them. So it's astounding to me that, Megan Shortreed should say that, oh, she didn't know how the process worked, or Sid saying that didn't know how the process worked. Or for that matter, Jackie thinking that she had I'm not surprised that Jackie thought that she had the power to, just to make the decision. She had a very imperious attitude towards her position. But you forget, Jean-Paul, that there were a couple of people who were still elected from the new iteration of the slate, and they didn't want those people particularly to see it. Now, they may not have wanted their own people to know it either. I don't know about that, but it was clear in my mind that where you could sort of imagine Megan Shortreed and Jackie being in the treasurer's office, giggling with each other, where Jackie says, oh, do we really have to go to convocation? And I don't think we really have to go to convocation. They wanted to keep it away. They wanted to keep it away because they didn't want anyone to see it, particularly those people who were in the new iteration of the slate, because they knew that people would cause problems about it. And they didn't want people to know about it. That's what it comes down to. And in addition, you had this self-righteousness and this, what comes with a true belief in some sort of political agenda, that they know better than other people. And then the other thing the O'Connor report pointed out is that, the staff, or I should say the benchers were relying upon staff to tell them things. And, Megan Shortreed said, well, we relied upon staff. Well, you're elected to make the decisions. You can't just simply rely upon staff to tell you what your decision should be or how the process works, right? You have to know how the process works. Certainly, you could rely upon staff to say, listen, provide me with some background information about an issue, and staff will provide them with that. But then to go back and ask staff how the process works, that's not how it should work. And another example of that the culture of the problem, and how the reliance upon everything was, is that, Megan Shortry would often say to me, well, we just let committees decide things, and I don't question what committees do. And I'm looking and I'm thinking, what are you talking about? If it comes to convocation, I'm just simply supposed to approve what a committee has come up with. I don't get to question what the committee comes up at all. And so there was just this attitude where I think, as I called it, I wrote about it. It had this country club culture to it as well, where people just wanted their butter tarts, and they'd vote on things, and so they could just go on and get their butter tarts and have their lunch, and not really have to make hard decisions at all, not trouble themselves with the issues of governance. And that what it was like over 4 years at the law side. Let me just talk about something, back up and talk about neutrality and the importance of neutrality, Jean-Paul. And let me give you an example of something about why neutrality is so important. Back in World War One, it's a long time ago, but in World War One, there was a lawyer who, and there were lawyers who didn't agree with Canada's involvement in the First World War. Those people were disciplined by the Law Society because they were felt that they weren't, they weren't appropriate lawyers, because they didn't believe in that sort of a national enterprise, or this nationalism, to go into World War One. Now, that's the danger of having a regulatory body engaging in a political agenda. No matter what you believe in, whether it is critical race theory or environmental or feminism or Marxism for that matter, you as an individual can believe whatever you want. But you can't have any of those ideologies being taken on by the Law Society itself. A number of years ago, I can't remember when it was, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think it was the Harris government, had sort of provincial government had divested itself of a number of regulatory bodies. Now, the Law Society has always been on its own, but it did that because it didn't want to get into micromanaging the different professions, like funeral directors. So I think Michael also talked about this, Cochrane, when he was on your show a little bit. And well, you have that delegated down authority, is the authority is limited, and the authority is limited to, as I said, initially at least, the competency and ethics. But when you brought in that 4.2, it allowed certain lawyers to think, oh, well, we could bring on one of these social agendas, and we could politicize the Law Society. We could politicize the Law Society. And that's what's been happening. That's part of the problem. I said the mission creep, is it's become overly political. And now it's become almost this slavish obeisance to diversity, for example. And just in the last convocation, Peter Wardle, who was putting together some financial committee, I can't remember what it was. Now, you think of financial committee, the first concern should be people who have the financial literacy and acumen. That should be your first concern about who's going to be on that committee. But no, the first question was asked, well, we have to make sure that that committee is diverse. So in other words, people didn't care about whether people had any financial acumen at all who were on that committee. They just cared about whether the committee was diverse at all. Diversity may be an important issue in some respects, but when you're governing, you got to make sure that, whatever committees you have, the first important aspect of who sits on that committee is, the purpose of the committee, finances. So that's that sort of example of the mission creep and the slavish obedience to a political agenda, which has ruined the neutrality of the Law Society, and is certainly causing some of the problems that we're seeing today, and why I think the Law Society has to be taken back in 2027.
Okay, so let's look at kind of the structure, because I don't know, certainly, obviously, um, the issues that come up from, as you point out, committees, right, is isn't that a way to have sort of discourse, whether it's about compensation, whether it's about financial, whether it's about any of the other, the restaurant even, or any of the groups that are there. But as you say, well, then it should come back to convocation for debate and discussion, and again, as you point out, maybe they don't agree with the committee, and part of that also is, I mean, it's kind of not as, in the news, so to speak. They did table a kind of proposal, or they put it out to the public in terms of, or the lawyers and paralegals, about structural change of things like having fewer benchers and having um, some people appointed and by elections. I think instead of just the next one up. So I don't know if you'd given any thought to some of
Oh
those.
yeah, listen, that was just that came out of the good governance's promise that they will never have slates again. Um, and it was interesting. Again, I don't want to pick on Stephen Rothstein, but I just because I watched his video and you asked him that question, he said, "Well, they did it. We need this necessary evil in order to get rid of them." That's essentially was his answer. Listen, slates are important. They come up throughout the history of the law, so they've popped up. The Law Society was initially, founded in 1791 or so on, and over time, the benchers back in, I think it was 1807 or something, they realized the necessity for increasing the numbers of the Law Society because they needed the regional representation. Because really, the fundamental difference in the way law is practiced in Ontario is regionally. Sometimes the resources in the north don't match the resources in the south. We may have a library, they may not have enough money for a library. So it was really a regional issue, and that's why the structure of the convocation where you vote is based on 20 inside, 20 outside Toronto, and then it's divided up into the different regions. That was the fundamental importance of representation in Ontario. That's always been the fundamental importance of representation in Ontario. That's how the Law Society should elect people from the regions. Like in Canada, we have regional representation. Similarly in Ontario, in the legislature and in the law side. So that's what we have to keep the regional representation. The second thing is slates have naturally occurred in the law side. Most before ours, the most recent one was in the 90s, late 90s, when you had the solicitors were upset about levies on real estate. And so a number of solicitors ran together and to represent their area. So you've got divisions within sort of the solicitor barrister, and you've got divisions within the region. Those are the fundamental, or I should say the fundamental is the regional, and then sometimes an issue comes up like in the 90s, and the solicitors got together and voted a bunch of solicitors. So we should never get rid of the concept of having a slate, because slates are important for the different professions. Maybe there'll be something the immigration lawyers will be upset about, or criminal lawyers will be upset about. So there's nothing illegitimate about slates. We shouldn't get rid of them. I'm gonna ask you to share once again your the only thing that should be changed electorally is that people should not be allowed to run underneath the corporation. So what I have here is I actually have the filings under the Ministry of Public and Business and Service Delivery, which is the Bencher Good Governance. The Good Governance Coalition was actually a corporation, as you could see. People don't realize this, and registered by Brendan Wong, who I think is a treasurer now. And the corporate, sorry, I think I may have just, oops, sorry. Give me a moment. Sorry about this. I'm trying to look for I had the directors. Who were showing you who the directors were. Here we go. So the directors of the organization were Brendan Wong, Atricia Lewis, Michelle Lamazo, and Megan Shortreed. And the office that it was out of, which was registered, was actually Bordner Ladner Gervais. So they incorporated what was the in
You said 2021 there, looks like it.
yeah, 2021. And that's this address is Bordner Ladner Gervais. So they incorporated. incorporated in 2021. Go back to stop sharing. And when you take a look at what they did with the website and the videos and the robot calls and everything else, and the professional campaign manager, they must have at minimum had raised about $250,000 in their campaign. So, where does that money come from? I can only imagine that, it wasn't just Tricia Lewis in response to an article I had written, or I had some things I had said. She said, well, all the money came from individual donors, and that's not true. We know, for example, the Criminal Lawyers Association gave $2,000 to them. So where else did they get? And there's 50,000, 60,000 legal professionals. To raise $250,000 with 60,000 people. I think it was really, the base to the large corporations, or I should say the large firms were giving money over to the Good Governance Coalition. So that's what really needs to be changed, if anything, is making sure that you can't run as a corporation. That's the real concern, I think, in terms of electoral reform. But you're not going to hear that at all, most likely. Now, I don't know if going forward they're going to try and continue with trying to reduce the number of benchers at all. I mean, their argument is that, well, it makes things more efficient. Well, we could see how efficiency works, right? I mean, how much more efficient can you be if you have two people making a decision, right? Megan Short-Reed and Jackie Horvath making a decision about whether convocation should be consulted or not. That's pretty efficient, but efficiency doesn't lead to good decision making. So I can't. It'd be interesting to see if whomever becomes the new treasurer, if that treasurer will try and continue on with that proposal. But again, I think that proposal goes to show you about how they think that they know better than other people, right? They were going to get rid of 10 elected legal lawyers, and then they would set up a committee to appoint those lawyers. So taking away the legal profession's ability to vote people, so they want to reduce accountability for themselves.
Yeah, one of the things that I found, I mean, I think I sent in, my sort of feedback there, and I've certainly talked to a number of these people when they were running like yourself, was, well, why don't you just make the committees? If you're talking about appointments, like that should be open to non-benchers. Then you have real discussion about some of those issues, and then they can table their report to convocation, as you were talking about. Well, it wouldn't be rubber stamped then, because the board, the benchers would be just getting these kind of proposals. I mean, like, again, other organizations will have larger committees, and then they'll have a smaller board that kind of goes through. There'll be the finance committee's report. There'll be the whatever policy report. The law study tribunal group's report on things, right? And that way, you'd have non-benchers kind of involved, where it perhaps would avoid sort of this inherent, well, I'm also on these three committees, and then I'm part of the board, where you'll have, as you termed it, like a country club atmosphere, because they're trusting their colleagues who are also on the board that they were elected with in a large portion, that they're doing the job, right? I mean, I think you'd feel a little confident saying, well, I know Sam, and if he's on this committee and says this is the right thing to do, then I'm not going to give it the full 85-page review of the pros and cons, right? Which then leads into that sort of group mentality, right? I mean, what are your thoughts there in terms of others, or in terms of structural things with respect to whether it's making the board smaller but opening up committees to others, or kind of what went wrong here, right? In terms of, you're saying the staff have too much of the ear of the board, and I think a large percentage of the people who are part of this new group weren't benchers 4 years ago, right, in 2019, or 6 years ago in 2019. So how much of it is deferring to the more established kind of core of those who've been around for a number of years?
Well, let me just say, first of all, what you're saying is premised on your other benchers accepting and respecting what you have to say. And that certainly didn't happened when I was there from 2019 to 2023. If you were a good bencher, in other words, if you voted along with them, then you got to sit on a committee and people would listen to you. And there was a number of people on the slate who became, frankly, co-opted, who were more concerned about being liked by the good government, the predecessor of the good government coalition, than carrying out what they were elected to do. Um, so there's a problem of the cultural attitude towards people who come in and want to change things. That's the problem. One problem. Second problem is that with Diana Miles, she was not happy with the good governance, sorry, not happy with us, and other people set the tone on how the staff should relate to the slate, right? So if we asked a question to a staff, the staff wouldn't answer our questions, or it would be rare to answer our questions. But if someone else asked a question, the press asked the Good Governance Coalition, then the staff would go out and answer their question. So, it comes from the top. The third thing about non-benchers being on committees. Well, there are eight, I think, believe there's 8 lay appointments, right, who are not lawyers, who are supposed to be from the public, who were appointed by the provincial government and who sit at convocation, who are supposed to give a, non-legal, non-paralegal, non-lawyer input into some of the decisions. And so we have that. I think it's not so much about bringing more people into the decision-making process. I think it's just about opening up the decision-making process. Let me go back again in a little bit of history lesson. In the late 90s, when Clayton Ruby was elected, there was a lot more secrecy going on. Everything was secret. You had no public portions of the convocation. And he would leave convocation. And at that time, there was more legacy media who were interested in convocation and reporting on it. That's a bit of a problem, is the lack of reporting. It's good that your program is so important because you will cover the issues of the law study every once in a while. There's the Law Times and Law 360, but they don't do very good jobs of covering on an ongoing basis what's going on at the law study. I mean, again, the Toronto Star, it was leaked to the Toronto Star. Those legal publications didn't talk about the story at all. But to go back, Clay Ruby would constantly ignore the secrecy provisions and talk about what was going on. And so that led to the open convocation that we had a while ago. But now what's going on is, no sooner do you finish the land acknowledgement, you vote on the agreed agenda, and then you go into in-camera proceedings. So, there's the lack of lack of transparency that I think is the real problem in the law society. In order to have that transparency, one of the things you're going to have to do is get rid of the Bencher Code of Conduct. And indeed, if you look at the Bencher Code of Conduct, you'll see in it, there are sections of the Bencher Code of Conduct that really talk about relations between, benchers shouldn't be overburdening staff. So if you want to have transparency, the first thing you got to do is, as I said, change the culture. And practically what you can do to change that culture is to get rid of the Bencher Code of Conduct. So again, it's a cultural issue, Jean-Paul. It's a culture against transparency. It's anti-transparency. It's opaque, if anything. And I don't think we need more people on committees. Rather, we just need to have those committees to be transparent.
Okay, so I mean, then looking at that aspect there of the Badger Code of Conduct, because I mean, no, I've had I talked to Michael and Anita, and again, I've left open for any bencher, and I've reached out to a few, but I would imagine that nobody's going to come forward. I mean, necessarily it doesn't have to be me; it could be anyone else, but because of that code, they might be said, well, you spoke to JP and you said this, and this, and now you're going to get disciplined, or you spoke to Maya or whoever else that kind of has interest in this. And so that kind of prevents, because I would love to obviously have someone from the good governance group or a sitting bencher to kind of discuss publicly, right? Or the Law Times or Law 360 or whoever, right? Of kind of what's happening, right? Because I think that perspective is we don't really know what's going on. And even with this whole CEO issue, a lot of it was like we don't, you know, it's privileged information, or you know, it took a lot of sort of push to get, you know, things like the O'Connor report open, right? And I think that creates, you know, a larger concern if, well, regardless of this issue, well, what about everything else that's going on at the Law Society? What do we know, and what do we not know? And as lawyers, or even just the general public or paralegals, shouldn't we know, sort of, you know, we're paying thousands of dollars, right? Like, what's going on, and why don't we have access, or why is it controlled access? And you know,
Yeah, well,
if you're saying the venture code of conduct is step one to open that up, well, what else needs to kind of be done to be more transparent?
let's not forget the fact that the as soon as it became apparent that the compensation package had happened, I think the first thing that um, Peter Wardle or the law study did was they hired a media management company, right? That was more important, is managing the message, right? Again, that just goes to show you how their lack of transparency, they're concerned about their own image. You know, the cover up is worse than the infraction, right? If they just would have come open and honest and clean with what happened, I think things would have a lot better for them. But they tried to cover it up, and they tried to get a media uh, government corporation advisors to tell them how to cover it up, and make themselves look better. They weren't interested in solving the problem. Look, again, I think it's just simply an issue of transparency. There's no reason why the treasurer can't come and simply talk to you at all. I made venture code of conduct complaints against Megan Shortreed, Jack, and Sid Troyster. I suggested that Peter Wardle can't be. It's the treasurer sits in judgment. The treasurer can't do it as a result of the Hansel McLaughlin report, which talked about his own involvement in the compensation fiasco. Maybe Peter Wardle is leaving it to a new treasurer to decide what to do with the venture code of conduct complaint. But it has that BCC venture code of conduct has a chilling effect. And I'll give you an example of how it was wielded against people. Phil Horgan, I think it was when he was running up against Jackie, had made some comments to the Law Times about criticizing one of the issues, one of the programs, or one of the initiatives the Law Society wanted to have. And it had already been reported. It had already been out there in public about this policy, but there was a venture code of conduct complaint made about him. And Teresa Donnelly, who was the treasurer at the time, called up Phil and said, "Oh, I have to talk to you about what you said in the Law Times." And Phil said, "Well, it was already out there. I have every right to say it." I can't remember the result of what happened, but there is a good example of how, it was used to chill people, to prevent people from speaking about things. It was prevented, it was used to prevent Phil, a prospective treasurer, because he was running in that election, just to tell the public what he actually believed and why he wanted to be treasurer. So that's how it's constantly used. And again, you can get rid of the venture code of conduct, um, uh, venture code of conduct, but you need to have someone who's not going to try and use other ways of trying to prevent people from talking. And you need that cultural change. And that's why I keep coming back to taking back the law sign in 2027. So if you don't mind, Jean-Paul, let's just talk a little bit going forward. And I keep talking about what do I mean by, taking back the law sign in 2027. It's because there is going to be a bench election in 2027. I think people who are concerned about what's going on at the Law Society should get involved. People who are concerned about what's happening at the Law Society should support people who are getting involved, if you don't want to run yourself. But I think that's the main thing. But then in addition to that, well, okay, so what can we do if we get elected? I think you have to have an independent audit of the Law Society. As I was saying before, you've got little pool, you've almost got little pots of cash throughout the Law Society, and that budget breakdown doesn't really describe where the money all goes to. There is a big basket full of programming. I know some of the programs, that get the money from it, but we don't. I'll give you here's an example. The Discrimination Harassment Council at that time when I was there was getting about $160,000 a year. But when I looked at them, I had asked for, well, they were getting, I think it was anywhere from 200 to $300 an hour for what they were doing. Now, remember, all they were doing is answering a phone. And if you had a complaint about a paralegal or a lawyer, they would say to you, well, have you gone to the Human Rights Commission? Do you want to report to the tribunal? That's all their job was. It wasn't giving legal advice at all. They were getting, as I say, somewhere between $200 and $300 an hour. I asked for their dockets for the preceding year, so we knew how much they were actually working. And I was never given those dockets. When I went back, I found that the last real audit of the DHC, Discrimination Harassment Council, happened about 2010 or 2011. But afterwards, no one ever looked at, no one ever oversaw that organization, that program at all. And it was obviously they didn't have any, they weren't giving over any dockets, because when I brought it up to Teresa's attention, in the next contract that was given out to the three lawyers that were staffing the DHC, there was a provision in the contract that said you had to actually hand over your dockets to the head of programming. So they they didn't have that before. I don't know how they were getting paid, but there is an example of the lack of oversight. And that program is a program which just really, it's not needed. And it's just taking up money, but it just, once a program gets affected, then it just continues on and no one ever really looks at it to see if it's worthwhile at all. So you got to have I think you have to have an audit. You have to know where your money is going. If it doesn't have to do with competency and ethics, we should get rid of those programs. And we need to know how many people work at the Law Society and what they actually do. That would be a second thing. Getting rid of the Venture Code of Conduct is another thing. I think that the Good Governance Coalition has done so much damage, reputational damage to the Law Society of Ontario, that I think the only way the public's going to regain confidence in the organization is actually to go back to the name of the Law Society of Upper Canada, to let the public know that the 8 years or so of the incompetency of those people who have been running it, the predecessor of the Good Governance Coalition and the Good Governance Coalition, that they're not there any longer and now present as a new organization, really the old organization, Law Society of Upper Canada, to show the public that to win over their confidence again in terms of the legal profession. So those are some of the ideas which I think have to happen in order for the public to regain confidence in the Law Society.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly, obviously, we've seen swings in both directions, right? You had sort of, as you term it, the predecessor of the Good Governance Coalition, and then you had the Statement of Principles, which kind of galvanized your group then, and we kind of went into a different direction with your slate then getting elected, and then 2 years ago, swinging back over with the Good Governance Coalition being elected, and you're saying, 2 years from now, to take back the Law Society. I mean, of course, at the end of the day, there's also sort of kind of the middle of the road ground, right? Is where, for example, you're mentioning the Discrimination Harassment Council or some of these DEI initiatives, and again, maybe it's one pillar in focusing on competence, right? You hear like trauma informed lawyering, where there's elements of that to be professional and competent, but not necessarily, as you're pointing out, when you flow into a different direction, that's the first thing that they go to, right? If you're creating a financial committee, and then they're looking at diversity in that committee before they look at who's got the financial competence, right? But certainly, again, as you've pointed out, that the directions are kind of going back and forth of where do we see our regulatory body, because there is pretty two polarizing sides, right, as to
Oh,
where.
so I'm going to
Yeah.
interrupt you. I'm sorry, John. Let me push back. I don't think it's a polarizing side. I don't think I don't think I'm representing some opposite, um, some opposite position, and there has to be a middle. I think I am the middle. I'm suggesting that a regulatory body has to be neutral, right? That's all I'm trying, and I don't think that's a controversial issue, right? Because if you don't have neutrality in your regulatory body, then you're making decisions based upon a political agenda. And that's not good for the profession, because those people who don't believe in the political agenda, again, whether it's Marxism or anything else, are seen as unfit to govern. It's exactly what happened. So I just want, you know, the organization to be neutral. I don't think that's I don't think that's one side or the other. I think that is actually the middle. And again, I can go back into further historical examples of where the Law Society had become political and suffered as a result of it. So, we have delegated authority from the government. That delegated authority was expanded in 2006. Up until 2006, the function of the Law Society was about competency and ethics. And then 4.2 is added in terms of the principles, right? The principles are now swallowing up the functions. And the Law Society, all I'm suggesting is we become neutral again. And we go back to what we're really about, not trying to push anyone's political agenda, no matter how worthwhile some people may think it be, or no matter how fashionable it may be at the time. That is not the role of the Law Society, of a regulatory body. That may be the role of government. If people want to engage in that sort of discussion, I encourage people to get involved in politics at the larger level. Federal or provincial or municipal. Those are the areas where those types of societal issues can be worked out. But it's improper to start saying that a regulatory body for real estate people should take on a social agenda, political agenda, or the funeral regulators, or
Because
any
that's where
other.
you get into the mission creep, right? And as Michael and then you've pointed out, like
Sorry, I'm in a hotel lobby, and it's early in the morning, and they're vacuuming it, so I can't hear you very well. So
no, I was
so
just going to say that gets into the point about mission creep, right? That you and Michael had raised about, what is the role of, I mean, and that as a larger, as you point out, any regulatory body, what's their role in running this profession or any other profession? And certainly, 2 years from now, we're kind of halfway through the term, as you point out. That'll be up for the lawyers and paralegals to decide, what kind of involvement they want to see the future benchers. But I did want to, I mean, obviously, kind of look at wrapping up
No, I'm
here
gonna
with,
go, but
yeah.
I'm sorry, Jean-Paul, I'm gonna interrupt you. I apologize. I'm gonna push back. The role is what's delegated to us, right? That you're saying what, I mean, there's no issue as to what the role is. The role is the function of the Law Society should be about making sure Ontario's lawyers are competent and ethical. That's what the role of a regulatory body is, whether it's real estate, funeral directors, dentists, engineers. The public is best served when you have competent and ethic engineers. The public is best served when you have competent and ethical dentists, doctors, lawyers, paralegals. If you want to talk about what's in the best interest of the public, then it's competent people who know what they're doing and people who have integrity about what they're doing. Clients don't care who you are. Clients simply care whether you're going to keep their kids for them, keep them out of jail, or make sure that your real estate deal is going to go through. Making sure that lawyers can do that and not steal the client's money, that is the role of a regulatory body, a legal regulatory body.
So on that point, then, with respect to the staff, right? I mean, let's say, we fast forward 2 years. How is in terms of the balance of, I don't even call it power, with respect to access to information, transparency, and as you're pointing out, that not everything is in the control of the board or the benchers, and how is that, how would you say to sort of deal with that kind of, whether it's you called it the country club style of, well, the staff told me to do this, or the staff, I deferred to the staff. How can that be handled in terms of governance of who essentially makes the call of what the function of,
Well,
yeah.
again, the bencher, look, it's the elected representative that has to make the call. It's no different than in the federal government, provincial government, or municipal government. I mean, so obviously there's staff there. I don't think we need to have the hundreds of people that are there. If you go to my LinkedIn page, I have I found in Christopher Moore's book, history book of the Law Society, and it was published in 1995. He went back from 1950 to 1995, and he shows a progression of number of people from 95. We don't know what that progression is from 95 to 2026. I had to find the numbers on LinkedIn, which suggests 751 people that work at the law side. The vast majority are in the legal area. I'm not sure why. But then I found in the 2024 budget something that talked about full-time employees, and they talk about 521 full-time employees of the law side. Again, I don't know what all those people do at all. But I think, the staff obviously have a certain role. Their role should be, when asked, to provide information to all the benchers, not just some of the benchers, but the benchers have to ultimately are elected to make the decisions, and they should know the process in place for things like voting on compensation for a CEO. Shouldn't have to go back and ask the staff, oh, what's the process? That was the problem, is the over-reliance upon staff. The bureaucracy, if we can call it that, have a legitimate role, but they can't be running the place, which I think is certainly happening underneath Diane Miles. Now, underneath Priya Bhatia, I know Priya Bhatia. I think I liked her very much. We had a number of conversations. She was very circumspect in what she would be willing to tell me about what was happening behind the scenes with respect with Diane Miles as a rule. I think that she'll have a bit of a different uh, view of things, but I think she'll take her cues from the treasurer, which is what she should be doing, right? Diane Miles, again, decided a lot of times what was going to happen, and the treasurer simply went along with it, and convocation simply went along with it for two reasons. One of which I think people were a little bit too friendly with her. And you could see in the O'Connor report where it says, when she talked about, if I don't get my compensation because of the stressors in my job, and I'm thinking, what possible stressors do you have? You're running an organization where people just give you money. If you want to have stress, become a defense lawyer or a sole practitioner, then you'll see what real stress is. And then, so they thought, oh, we can't possibly, allow Diane to walk, because who else will possibly run this organization? There's hundreds, thousands of people, I think, can run the organization, other than Diane Miles, but they're afraid to let her go. They didn't want to let her go. And the second thing, as I alluded to before, is that they didn't want, the slate people to have anything to make hay out of, essentially, to argue about. So it really is, it's a cultural thing, Jean-Paul. I don't know how much more I could emphasize it, right? That, and I don't, it really is a cultural thing. And I think a lot of the problems will change when you have a change of the culture at the Law Society. And that culture has to be the understanding that it has to be really open to different perspectives, not shutting people down. Um, you know, in the last convocation meeting, the Toronto Lawyers Association presented a paper on civility. And I was laughing to myself because I wanted to ask the question, well, do you think it's civil to call other people unfit to govern? Right? So, it's just common sense type of thing. I'm sorry that the light it's morning for me where I am, and the light is coming through the hotel window, so you get this streak across from me. But it's just a cultural thing. It's a common sense thing. You don't need to have adopting this rule or that rule. I mean, you adopt all the rules that you want, but if you don't pay attention to the rules, then it doesn't really matter anymore.
Perfect. So, Sam, thanks again for taking the time to join us. If maybe you can sort of finish off with, for anyone, as you said, next election there is going to be in 2 years, and to take back the law society, as you've termed it. Uh, Maybe kind of summarize there, from your points there, the importance and the direction there in terms of governance of the law society, and what anyone listening can do to get more information.
Well, it'll be 2 years. There'll be an announcement that they're accepting nominations for people running benchers. Again, I encourage everyone to get involved. I think people should get involved and try and return the law side to the neutral position that it should be, that it is a regulatory body and it should be looking after competency and function. If we're concerned about, and it is an important organization. And again, the things we should be looking at doing is getting the independent audit, trying to re-enhance the reputation by perhaps going back to the name to showing the public outwardly that we're something different again, or that we're going back to our original values. And the transparency issues, not being afraid to let people know what's happening. I think those are sort of certain fundamental things. I have some idiosyncratic things I like to see, like bringing back the restaurant. I don't understand why the restaurant is still closed. I understand why it closed. It's funny, just to leave off on this, just to give you an example, I think blatant hypocrisy of the organization is the benchers voted that Diane Miles should have control over all the operations, the physical aspects of the Law Society, right? Of Osgoode Hall, which would mean that she would have the decision to bring back the restaurant. But, they only did that because they wanted to sideline members of the slate. And the reason why I say that is because now suddenly, when it comes to the operations, the physical aspects of Osgoode, suddenly the benchers have control over it again. They need to have a committee about it. That's just sort of the blatant hypocrisy of what happened over 2019, 2023. It's a cultural issue, and that's why people have to get involved to take back the Law Society in 2027.
Perfect. So once again, thank you so much, Sam, and thanks for anyone for listening. And of course, if any current venture or anyone really interested and has perspective there, I'm happy to certainly chat with anyone. And notwithstanding the venture code of conduct there, but I feel that you should be able to speak freely and frankly to anyone listening about what is happening. As Sam's pointed out, transparency being key. We need to know what's going on with Lost. I need to form our own thoughts and opinions, and it's great to get different perspectives. And thank you, Sam, again for sharing your perspective of being a
Thank
bencher
you.
for the past 4 years. And thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Thank you
Take
for
care.
having me. Bye-bye. Are we off, Sean?